Welcome, and thanks to all of you for joining us today. And a special thank you to IIoT for putting together such a great program today, and special thanks to Microsoft for sponsoring this closing panel. Let's start by familiarizing ourselves with the event tool. Take a look around for the chat and tell us where you're located or who you represent. Please post all your questions in the Q&A tool, not in the chat, as it will make it easier for us to answer them. This panel will focus on cybersecurity in the energy and utility sector, with some special attention to IT/OT in a hyper-connected environment. Our expert panelists will discuss the unique cybersecurity challenges faced by the industry, including protecting sensitive information, preventing system disruptions, and maintaining operational continuity in their organization. In addition, attendees, that's you, the audience, will better understand the evolving threat landscape, how to prepare their organizations to prevent, detect, and respond to cyber attacks. The panel will also explore the importance of collaboration and information sharing among industry stakeholders and the U.S. government partners to enhance critical infrastructure and specifically the energy sector's cybersecurity posture and resilience. I'm Don Davidson. I retired from DoD in 2019 with 44 years of federal service in a wide variety of positions, the last 15 focused on supply chain risk management. I'm now the Director of Cyber Supply Chain Risk Management at Synopsys. Our panelists are IT/OT critical infrastructure subject matter experts. I'll give only a very brief intro. They can elaborate more as they go through discussion. We'd like this to be an interactive dialogue, so please submit your questions for us to address later in the session. Jose Razo is an OT ICS leader at Microsoft, focused on helping Fortune 100 and 500 companies achieve compliance risk reduction through the development of holistic and highly integrated OT and ICS security programs. Danielle Jablonski is an OT cybersecurity strategist at Nozomi Networks, responsible for researching global cybersecurity topics and promoting operational technology and industrial control systems cybersecurity awareness throughout the industry. She is also a non-resident fellow at the Cyber Statecraft Initiative at Atlantic Council's Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security. Joyce Hunter is a strategic doer. She's a philanthropreneur and experienced executive, leveraging a diverse background in executive coaching, strategic management, and information technology, advising services to industry, nonprofit, and at all levels of government. Joyce is the executive director of the Institute of Critical Infrastructure Technology. Okay. I'd now like to give each panelist an opportunity to introduce himself and provide a brief initial comment on why the IT/OT hyper-connected world requires more cybersecurity attention, due diligence than ever before. Jose.
Sure. Hello, everybody. I'm Jose Razo. I work currently on the OT side of the house. As far as Microsoft, we focus primarily right now on our Defender for IoT product. And then to kind of go into the question, why do I think it's a much more important? Well, it increases your attack surface, and so you're going to have more places where you can actually be more vulnerable. And this is constantly changing, just because, as we all know, our environments, our OT environments, aren't air gapped as we once used to believe. And the other thing is these are always legacy systems. They're obsolete OT systems that need to have other types of protection. Some of the more modern technologies don't function as we would want them to, and some of the updates aren't available. So because of this, we want to try to increase this. And every day I keep hearing, we're getting to see more targeted attacks. And so all of this kind of combined makes it for us to want to pay more attention to it, just because it is going to consistently get worse. It's not going to get better anytime soon.
Danielle, how about you?
Thanks. So as a strategist, I do a lot of consultation internally and externally with customers from Nozomi Networks, also investors, folks that want to look at go-to-market strategy and how we really tie in greenfield versus brownfield cybersecurity analysis, but also deploying new technologies like IIoT in distributed environments or renewable energy, adding that to the grid. So I cover a pretty wide topology, if you will, of competing priorities. And I think that's really what we want to focus on in this panel today, is there are a lot of competing priorities. There are a lot of simulated attacks, and what we need people to focus on is better security outcomes. And that really boils down to focusing between perimeter security, which we know to be ineffective, and incident response, which we know is necessary, but doesn't cover all of the aspects of day-to-day security events that really could be targeted and tailored, but also if they're caught early enough, working through some of the NIST CSF functions and things like that, depending on your resource capacity, we really need to focus on, reducing the severity of any potential security event, not just doing perimeter security or incident response. So happy to unpack that today with my fellow panelists.
Great, thank you. And Joyce, how about your intro and a little bit of comment on the hyper-connected world?
Absolutely. Joyce Hunter, and I'm the Executive Director of the Institute for Critical Infrastructure Technology. We are a cybersecurity think tank focused in the area of not only cybersecurity, but critical infrastructure and national security. And it is extremely important for collaboration. Collaboration, integration, and operationalizing the human aspect, because it's all cultural. It never is the technology. The technology is an enabler. The biggest thing is for people to actually collaborate and work together. And that's what we do. We're conveners at ICIT, where we bring together people from government, nonprofit, academic, and we are able to actually promote that kind of collaboration throughout the industry. And that's necessary. If we're going to win in this race, we're going to have to learn how to work together, how to play nicely in the sandbox, because it really doesn't matter whose solution is on top. The matter is whether we're going to be able to best our adversaries.
So great intros by all of you. I think we might have lost Jose. Hopefully he'll rejoin us here. I lost the video contact with him. I do think that we're talking critical infrastructure, but we're mostly focused on the energy sector today. Danielle, I'd like to start off with asking you a question first, and the others can reply as well as they'd like to. But what's the nature of the threat landscape for both IT and OT, and how can security leaders begin to assess competing risk management priorities?
Yeah, thanks, Don. I am more of an OT-focused person, but we do know across the board that OT and ICS attacks start in IT, and a lot of IT attacks start with phishing and human impacts, like Joyce mentioned. So we also know that OT or ICS-specific attacks can sometimes be opportunistic or try to target low-hanging fruit and copy and paste repeatable TTPs, tactics, techniques, and procedures from threat actors, or code scripts, script kiddie, adversaries that produce any impact that they can potentially produce at a low cost, right? Back to that opportunistic landscape. But then there's something Jose mentioned, which is highly tailored. So at the same time, we're starting to see highly tailored techniques that are more custom and less repeatable, which require more resources and reconnaissance from threat actors, which are less likely to be used in widespread scanning and probing, but are also more likely to be successful because they've spent the time, they've done their research and their homework. And so if there's a will, there's a way in those highly tailored attacks. So unpacking that a little bit further, there's some needle in the haystack problems when you're trying to prevent these highly tailored and targeted attacks. You have a myriad of access points, right? You have the nefarious, nation state. You have criminal games looking to hold systems at ransom and exploit you for extortion. You have trusted insiders with privileged access that can be manipulated and hijacked. You have competitors, suppliers, partner ecosystems, as well as your customers with different structural access to your environments. And then you also have accidents, right? You have these user privileged access that can be manipulated if too much access is provided to the wrong people or for the wrong reasons, right? So we see a lot of frivolous data happening and frivolous exchange of communications in places where we know that the protocols themselves are insecure, right? So when you start to boil that all down, and you see cyber attacks on energy targets escalating and looking to cause physical damage to the grid, you have a ton of competing priorities, like you mentioned. So organizations and utilities and people that operate maybe regional versus substations, right, depending on what level they fit at the grid, are looking at which devices on my network are vulnerable and in need of special protections, which devices require firmware updates or other actions to close the gap on what can be exploited, and how to do vulnerability management with known vendor devices that have vulnerabilities that have been disclosed. How do we prevent and proactively do security for zero-day exploits that we don't actually know to be true and disclosed, but we know are still manifesting? How do we then also, cover devices, like I mentioned, that are insecure by design, meaning they either lack authentication, encryption, or other security standards that typically apply to IT applications and systems? And then back to those kind of systems of systems and access of access questions. How do we, get over the hump of this high number of third-party suppliers and supply chain issues that exacerbate this visibility challenge? And I think we'll unpack that a little bit today, but my number one piece of advice for prioritization is focus on consequences, not capabilities. And so I always tell people to take an effects-based strategy rather than a means-based strategy to basically reduce the risk of overall severe incidents impacting the worst-case scenario at your substation, at your plant, for your kind of routing of critical needs and customers, whether that's bulk impact or remote locations or regional management. And so it really does depend on what your best security outcomes look like and your worst kind of consequences might manifest. So we'll leave it at that so others can jump in, and I hope we get back to some of the issues I've brought up.
Great feedback, Danielle. Jose or Joyce, either want to add to that? And if not, that's perfectly all right. Okay, Jose. Yeah, I think it was very thorough. Thank you very much. Jose, over to you for a quick question. And once again, others can chime in as they'd like to. Considering the interconnectedness of critical infrastructure, what are the key considerations and best practices for establishing a robust incident response and recovery plans that encompass both IT and OT domains?
Sure. There's a lot of things to take into consideration. Some of the most standard pieces of information that I've seen just across clients is, fostering collaboration between the teams. A lot of times we don't always establish that directly. So these teams just be able to understand where the lines used to be and now kind of blurring those lines and being able to communicate with each other. Also doing some type of risk assessments, conducting thorough internal or even third-party risk assessments to kind of show you where the vulnerabilities may be at and where those vulnerabilities cross the lines between the OT segment and the IT segment. Trying to identify the classification of products. I've run into clients myself, and just to kind of sidetrack with the story, one switch was managed by half of it was managed by the OT team. The other half of it was managed by the IT team. And so trying to get that assistance isn't always there. And those lines shouldn't be there. I should be able to talk to one person that kind of either mitigates that communication and makes it easier for me to help, or, let's not split things up. Let's just, play as one team. Also trying to integrate, our response plans and making sure that these plans coordinate between both teams and not just the IT team. I've worked with clients in the past where I used to work for a consulting company, and so our plans worked primarily with the OT team. We barely ever involved the IT team, and if you did involve them, the plan was segmented. It was kind of hand off instead of continuous communication. And I think now that's kind of changing over the way I see things. You still have a few companies that maybe still do it that way, but a lot of companies are trying to blur those lines. And I constantly preach it's not really my role at this point to kind of dictate those plans, but I always give my 2 cents to clients when they're trying to come up with this plan and I'm trying to talk about things. A couple other things, continuous improvement. You want to continue updating your plan. You don't want to just make it and then set it aside, put it in the vault, and just guarantee that it's going to function. And then also continue to test those plans. Get your team involved, because unless you actually try, you're not going to find your mistakes. I've sat in a war room trying to figure out how we're going to resolve this plan, and then you start to see where the holdups are, where the bottlenecks are going to be, who was supposed to do this, and just it may look good on paper, but it doesn't always flow as easy as you would like. And it's the fun part, right? It's work and it takes effort. But I think if you sit down and really kind of hone in on some of these practices, it'll come out for the best for everyone.
Yeah, I think that's a great point about the IT and OT convergence. So I think that in the past we've always seen IT try to separate OT try to separate themselves from the IT environment. And more in the connected world that we're seeing for the future, they're going to have to work together. And I think that you're pointing out the idea that you probably have to tabletop or exercise your response is extremely critical. And that's where you'll identify those disconnects, as you just pointed out, that he thinks it's over the fence of that guy's problem or over the fence the other person's problem. And it really is an ecosystem or an enterprise problem. Joyce or Danielle, anything else to add on that piece?
I think that was extremely thorough, and you're absolutely right.
You guys are just too thorough. It just kind of squashes all the discussion because you're so good at answering the questions. Okay, Joyce, over to you specifically. Within the OT space, there is often a debate around modernization versus returning to analog. How do we convince key decision makers to invest in secure modernization that accounts for IIoT risks without pushing them towards reverting to cheaper, outdated solutions that set back resilience, interoperability, and security?
How long do we have?
We're actually a little ahead of schedule. We're doing really well.
Okay, I'm just going to.
But we are the last thing today. So the earlier they
well, the
get
last
out,
thing
you know the
between
drill.
us and somebody, going out and getting dinner or a drink or wherever you are in the world, breakfast maybe. So there's so much here, and I'm going to piggyback off of what Jose said. First, you got to understand their concerns, right? Seek first to understand before presenting your case. You got to critically understand what the concerns and priorities of the decision makers. Use a little emotional intelligence. What are their goals? What are their risks? What are their constraints? By aligning your arguments with their specific needs, then you can tailor your approach accordingly. Educate on the IIoT risks. Decision makers may not fully be aware of what's going on. They may hear things, they may see things on the news, but to actually understand what's going on, they need to have somebody come in and explain to them what are the risks, what are the benefits, what happens if you don't do it, and maybe that's a little bit of a scare tactic, but sometimes that's what it takes. Got to provide clear and concise explanations of the risks, include examples, statistics, other areas or other business operations that are doing something like this, that are in their competitive space. So education is the next one. The benefits of secure modernization. You got to talk about that, the cybersecurity, the enhanced operational efficiency, the increased productivity, the reduced downtime, better analytics capabilities, and long-term cost savings. That has to be in it as well. So those are the three areas. I mean, I could talk about 100 more, but being with the time that we have and wanting to get all the questions in and have the audience answer questions, I'm going to stop at those three, and I will probably come back to the others that I have on the list at a later point in the conversation.
So Joyce, I know that you also forwarded me an article today on NERC and FERC incentivization, right? And that's sort of directly tailored to the question you just answered about how do you, foster security in the modernization process. So you want to comment on that recent article and the relationship NERC and FERC trying to build security requirements in?
Absolutely. What they're trying to do is they're trying to incent utility companies. So if utility companies invest in modernization, they're going to provide them. Now, of course, it's going to, on the other end, it's going to raise our bill a little bit more. But if these companies invest in cybersecurity, they're going to provide them a break on the fees that they have to pay. So they're trying to involve these utility companies because they know that they're laggards in that area as far as modernization. So they're trying to develop these incentives for these companies to modernize faster.
Yeah, a little more carrot as opposed to stick, right? Yeah.
Yes.
So I've got a series of questions that are also available that you guys submitted, but I'm going to treat these more as toss-up questions. So I'm going to offer it up, and any one of you can jump in to answer them as you see fit. So how can organizations effectively foster collaboration, information sharing between IT and OT teams to address the evolving landscape, enhance their overall security? And I'd like to expand that a little bit because we're concerned about overall critical infrastructure, but specifically we're talking about the energy sector today. So any one of you want to jump in?
Well, with collaboration, especially since that's ICIT's specialty, you got to foster collaboration with industry peers, government agencies, and cybersecurity communities. And you've got to encourage participation in sector-specific ISACs so that everybody can stay up to date. Everyone is so busy, right? So it's very hard to participate in these meetings in person. So I think the best thing since sliced bread is, of course, virtualization that enables everybody across multiple genres to be able to, get up to date on information that they need. Collaboration is absolutely essential. Even if you just have podcasts or information so that people can gather together, there are a lot of great industry government organizations like ACT-IAC who have regular meetings on specific dates. Like later this afternoon, they're going to have a meeting on AI innovation. And they're going to have a series, probably, I think, about 6 or 7 weeks of these kinds of meetings. Some of them are going to be in person, some of them are going to be virtual, but that allows people the opportunity to actually talk about their initiatives and what they're doing, and also to collaborate. I know when I was the deputy CIO at the Department of Agriculture, one of the things that we put together was a CIO council, if you will. So all of the CIOs and all of the administrators throughout all of the business units, once a month, once every other month, would get together and talk about the projects that we were working on. Lo and behold, there was always one or more agencies doing the same thing, spending dollars that they didn't need to spend because they didn't know what the other was doing. So collaboration and information sharing is absolutely critical if we're going to build and sustain and have resilience in our cybersecurity and energy.
How about you, Jose? Danielle, want to add to that?
Sure. I guess I'll Joyce those great points there. I'll kind of bring it back down a little bit. I mean, trying to foster that communication between the OT team and the IT team, regardless of the sector. I think this is just basic, establishing clear communication channels. Being able to communicate with the right people and having access to the right people, I think, is always critical. I think most of the time when I used to have to do this, work with the IT team, when I focused primarily on OT, the hardest piece was trying to figure out who to talk to and what was the best way to get a hold of them. And so just establishing that and understanding that helps a lot. It just removes those minor roadblocks they think about. And then also coming up with, kind of tying into the earlier question, develop plans of security that include both teams and not make it a individual. That helps establish those communication, because you have to discuss this. You can't come up with a single plan without communicating between the teams. And then also, kind of with Joyce was saying, training for the teams so that they both understand not just OT threats for the OT team, but the OT team should understand IT threats, what that team is going to face and how that may affect them. Because in our statistics, you see that most of the threats for the OT environment will start on the IT side of the house. And so you do have to understand how that plays a part in your role, regardless of what side you're on.
Yeah, so I think it's really important to think about, you're not only collaborating within your sector, but you're also providing lessons learned on how to collaborate, threat environment with other sectors as well. And speaking of that space, I know Joyce's organization, iSight, just published Securing the Nation's Critical Infrastructure, a guide for the 21 to 25 administration. 50 different cyber experts contributed to that book. Just encourage you to seek the sources in that area. And also NIST has an ongoing IoT advisory board, public-private experts that are meeting throughout the year, going to publish a report at the end of the year, but they have quarterly open sessions at NIST where they're sharing IoT advisory information in that arena. Danielle, anything you want to add on the collaboration piece, or want to go to the next question?
I would just like to add, based on the IT-OT convergence conversation that Jose kind of dipped his toe into, that there tends to be this focus on larger than life scenarios or fear, uncertainty, and doubt when we try to communicate among and between teams. And it's ironic to me that becomes the focus when in day-to-day security for practitioners, what you see is low-hanging fruit. So I think we need to have more low-hanging fruit conversations with these teams when we're doing interoperability, and less FUD conversations. So those low-hanging fruit conversations, if we have them in an attack space, that looks like, well, what is the access we can prevent with multi-factor authentication? And for OT, what systems can be hardened? What systems have host-based firewalls that are not configured properly? This is not sexy security stuff. This is not the Black Start Ukraine energy scenario, but it is a place where you can have ongoing dialogue that's consistent and actually benefits your overall business, your planning, and your cooperation. And I'll add to that, the rate-based incentive conversation isn't just about passing the cost on to your customers. It's also about the ability for your business to adopt new models. So moving from capital expenditures to operational expenditures, where you can actually purchase subscription models over time, right? It's a different conversation, but it's one that you can have across your organization that doesn't have to be about, preventing the worst case scenarios and doing that consequence driven conversation. It can be about what is the easiest thing we can do today? How do we look at the CISA CPGs and pick the 3 cheapest ones? And how are we doing on those? How can we self-assess? Again, it's not like the most high profile meeting you're ever going to be in, but it actually will benefit you in the long run to have those consistent low hanging fruit kind of check-ins across your teams.
Yeah, I think those are great points. And I'm going to jump around the questions that I sent out to you guys earlier, because I think this leads directly into the vast majority of risk to IIoT networks still originates from poor personnel cyber hygiene. How can we best improve cybersecurity and cyber hygiene training and retention? What role do employees training and awareness play in mitigating cybersecurity risk within the energy and utilities industry? Joyce, you first.
Oh my goodness. Okay, so cyber hygiene goes back to training, right? It's still actually it's cultural. So it's getting people to utilize what they have. So develop training programs that are specific to the IIoT energy sector. Customize the content, if you can, to the unique challenges and technologies and regulatory requirements relative to that specific industry, and include such topic as remote access, secure configuration management, incident response in energy infrastructure, and compliance with industry standards and regulation. Practical hands-on exercises. Gamification is one of the things. Kids like games and so do adults. Utilize gamification techniques to make training more engaging and interactive. People can take these computer-based training things and they just click right through and nothing really sticks with them, but create challenges and quizzes and competitions that encourage participation and reward employees for demonstrating good cyber hygiene practices. This can boost motivation, increase retention, and create a sense of friendly competition among the employees. Have these challenges once a month, and then have a raise the flag for each individual team. And then regular security reminders. Implement regular security reminders through emails, newsletters, multimedia. Everybody learns a different way. There are people who learn visually, there are people who learn kinetically, and then there are people who are auditory learners. So you have to check all of those quick tips, best practices, real world examples, fun videos that people can do that spoof the cybersecurity industry in energy. Reinforcing these reminders do help keep cybersecurity at the forefront of the employees' minds and encourages them to practice good cyber hygiene habits.
Great. Danielle, Jose, anything?
I personally don't love the cyber hygiene analogy just because I don't think anything subjective is very useful, right? I think that we should have objective security measures and objective outcomes and objective controls. Now, that doesn't mean that the exact same objective truths are shared across every organization. It depends on your size, your budget, your resource, your risk, your centralization of risk, your backup plans, your mitigation, right? But those things can be considered more rational than something that is subjective. Another term that gets thrown around a lot, especially in the solutions space where I support and monitoring, is the word visibility. The word visibility is a very subjective word, and we kind of consider it to mean the subjective truth. But if you actually look back at some of CISA's best practices for securing the electric subsector, the human element will always be the weakest link, right? We know that's true. But at the same time, we see practitioners really focused on shiny objects, amazing promises from new AI technologies and quantum computing. There's a huge gap there if we know that the human element is the number one risk, but we're still kind of, our heads are on a swivel for the coolest new technology. The number one way to protect networks is to identify, for OT, is to identify, minimize, and secure all the network connections to ICS, right? That is an objective truth. And so I think we need to stop focusing on subjective things that we can do, recognize that the human error will always kind of be our point of failure, and find ways to build redundancy, right? Defense in depth strategies that, yes, of course we should be educating, but we shouldn't try to improve hygiene to the effect that the human element will ever go away, right? Or completely be solved. And I also wanted to just point to 2 resources, only because I mentioned the shiny object effect. there's also this proliferation of information, right? New best practices, new standards. I mentioned the CPGs, I mentioned the CISA subsector things. There are two dated, quote unquote, dated materials from NIST. One is the special publication 800-30, Guide for Conducting Risk Assessments. Just because this was published in 2012 does not mean that we have net new technologies in 2023. A lot of these things have not changed over the last decade. However, some of these more dated documents don't get referenced as much anymore because we're so focused on this 24-hour news cycle and kind of new updates and best practices. The other one I would point to is the SP Special Publication 800-94, Guide to Intrusion Detection and Prevention Systems. Now, we've come a long way in terms of this technology, but the business case and building the business case and the use case for these technologies is really well scoped here. And it's not done in a way where you are comparing sales and marketing in the market. It's done in a ground truth way where you can actually assess, does this meet my needs or not? Am I looking at network-based wireless behavioral analysis or host-based intrusion protection, and why? And does that actually meet my risk framework? Does that meet where I'm at with my personnel and my resource constraints? So I just wanted to point people to some historical references that might seem out of date just because they're over a decade old. But in reality, once you start to read these things, you're like, why are these not referenced more often? Because we're so focused on shiny objects.
Yeah, I think those are great points. But you mentioned something in that discussion about the emerging technologies and what we have new in the space. So what are the emerging technologies or trends that hold these potential to significantly impact the security landscape for both IT and OT environments? How can organizations adapt to leverage these advancements? Jose, how about you?
That's a great question. I think a lot of these, trying to take some of these new enhancements is going to take some time. I think, when we talk about all the buzzwords you hear now, ChatGPT, AI, and machine learning, all of these things are fairly new. But I think companies can sit down and really kind of focus on some of what does this really mean for us as an employee. I did a talk not too long ago, and the big buzzword, of course, was ChatGPT, and so a lot of people have worries behind this, and they want to understand, how is this going to affect me on a day-to-day, especially when these pieces of software can write code, right? I read a great article that stated that, for a long time, programmers, anyone who wrote code was pretty safe. That's a great job to have, and no one can really just do that out of thin air. And now that kind of happens, right? I personally, I'm not the best coder, but I can definitely use the ChatGPT to make myself look a little bit better. But leveraging these for the right products. I mean, Microsoft has a great strategy coming out that I can't really dive too deep into, but a lot of this is going to get baked into our day-to-day lives. And I think just being able to be open to these new technologies is going to be the best thing you can actually do. Kind of to what Danielle's point, kind of going back to the last question with the shiny object syndrome, or Rebecca Moore did a great piece a couple years back. You can look it up on YouTube on this shiny object thing. And so I think we get caught up on that, kind of to Danielle's point. We don't want to just jump into all the new shiny objects, but some of these new technologies, they do have a great purpose that we can kind of take and leverage. And I think if you kind of do your due diligence and really research what it is you're trying to get from this, you'll be able to take advantage of these new landscapes. Cloud computing is a big one. I focus probably as much as Danielle does on the OT end of the house, and the cloud is not always. It's kind of been a bad word in for a long time. I work with utility companies, and they're afraid to go to the cloud, or they have regulations that stipulate you can't really go up into the cloud, and we're going to have verticals that will be stuck there, so they can't really leverage all of these. But understanding and being able to change the narrative and put in the right language into these new standards moving forward, I think would be the best way these companies can actually leverage these.
Yeah, following more on the emerging technologies, you can either answer, Danielle and Joyce can add to that one, if I'll add additional question in that space. What challenges do utilities face in choosing the security tools and services given the vast and often expansive tapestry of available solutions in the market? So either comment on emerging technologies, or why is it a challenge trying to choose the right emerging technologies?
Yeah, I'll jump in just because I am in a solution vendor space, and I won't pitch Nozomi Networks at all. I think you need to ask hard questions, and finding trusted advisors to know which questions to ask is not the easiest task. I will say in the pattern recognition and anomaly detection space, we've seen leaps and bounds from the technology from a couple of years ago. Just because we've made leaps and bounds in that technology doesn't mean it's the best use case for your environment. So you really do have to map your business case to the solution you're choosing within your resources. But one thing I will say on, the types of security tools we see deployed in utilities, typically on-prem, of course, when we're talking about OT, make sure that you're looking at intuition. So this is something that I personally have done a lot of research on. I wrote a paper on building intuition into security. And that means understanding that the vendor, for whatever type of solution you're choosing, whether it's identity and access management or network monitoring, understands the context of your operations. So when we look at security products that just check a database for a matching parameter, that's not intuition, that's recognition. A lot of tools are built on recognition, and a lot of security recognition can reduce the severity of impacts in your organization. But when you have a limited amount of resources, you need to go a step further and make sure that those vendors understand the context of your operations, the deep packet inspection of the protocols you own and operate every single day to meet your mission. And I think once you start to do the due diligence to ask those questions for, peeling back some of the marketing and saying, can you do this? Can you produce that? Do you have some type of third-party assessment that I can review for even a similar environment where I can say, oh, they actually understand the context of my operation and their product and solution will deliver intuition and not just pattern recognition? That's already going a step further than most people have done for those installments that are going to take a matter of time. So I also would hedge against low-hanging fruit, and even some of the open source technologies, they might seem like great alternatives, but if you have really large scale operations, even something open source might take a year to deploy and configure correctly. And then you might max out your scalability and then have to go back to the market and buy something on the market when you've spent all this time deploying something open source. If you have a much smaller scale business, then open source might meet your scalability requirements because you don't have that much to pipe through. So those bandwidth and throughput conversations become really, really paramount as well. So just do your research, I think, is the best advice, and ask hard questions of the vendors.
Joyce, anything to add? Yeah,
absolutely. I think for both Jose and Danielle, I think they are both, absolutely on target. I like to coin something called collaborative adaptation. Peter Drucker always said, innovate or die. Well, sometimes it might not be a bad idea to die. Because just going after the shiny new thing is not necessarily going to get you the results that you want. You can call mine a Joyceism, which is a collaborative adaptation. How are you and your team going to handle that change? Is that change a product change? Is it a change to culture? Is it a change to something else within the organization? You have to kind of unpack all of that and take a look at the organization as a whole. You can't just say, just because one utility company is doing it this way, that it also subscribes to what I may be doing in Maryland versus North Carolina versus Kentucky. So I think you have to take each one separately and not, bulk them all together and say, okay, this is the energy industry and we're all going to march down the same path. It doesn't work that way. You have to take a look at your own organization and then do collaborative adaptation.
great answers, all three of you. This year, we've seen attempted domestic physical attacks on OT infrastructure and international APT attacks on IIoT infrastructure. What's the best balance against adversaries of varying degrees or sophistication and a diversity of cyber physical domains? Any one of you three.
Go, Joy. I could jump in if not. No, sorry, I'll jump in since I already opened my mouth there.
Yeah, none of you are bashful. Go ahead, Jose.
All right, no problem. It's going to be pretty. I mean, we're going to stick to fundamentals, right? Layered approach. I think that Joyce have hit on it. There's no one solution for any vertical or any space here. Having different, understanding what your requirements are, how's your environment affected? I think Joyce mentioned, you can be one company with 3 locations, and each location may need a different tool. They may not, based on their own operational requirements, or if they understand each location's threat landscape better, then you can get the right solutions for yourself. And I think, that layered approach is going to be the best thing. I think everybody comes, like the clients that I work with, they come to me and say, hey, we want the one tool that's going to do it all. And, unfortunately, if I had that tool, I'd probably have a lot more money and probably be sitting somewhere very nice right now. But that's the case, is there's no one solution. And just like Danielle said, you can't just, just because we have one solution doesn't mean it's the best solution. I try very hard to be not, yes, I work for a vendor. Yes, we do have sales products, but at the same time, sometimes you got to realize that, just because we offer the solution doesn't necessarily mean that that's going to be the best fit. And sometimes their requirements just don't meet our what we are able to offer for them. And so, many companies have that best of breed strategy. And that, even I would argue, it's not always the same. Just because it's the best in breed doesn't mean it works in your environment. I think just kind of sitting down and figuring out what layers you need, how many you need, and what's going to make the most sense is it's very fundamental, but it's going to hold true for many different clients and different aspects of security.
Yeah, I would say Jose mentioned basics. Segmentation and microsegmentation, right? That's something we hear as a feature of OT and ICS networks, repeated. Even a VLAN for something that has read-only commands is still better than connecting read-only devices to a network where you have other control systems that are required, mission critical, or crown jewels, however you want to build that construct. What I will say is there is no man-to-man security for embedded devices, period. So the scale of that problem, if we're talking industrial grade deployments, means you have so many devices, there's never going to be a one-to-one security, even policy typically, to address the security by design limitations of some of these devices. And no offense to the manufacturers, they're not getting any smarter, these devices, right? They are what they are. And I think that there's two ways to get around this. One, I said at the very beginning, is reduce the amount of frivolous data transiting your network. If it doesn't need to go somewhere, make sure that it's not going there. And then with that, make sure that not too many people have access to that, right? So something I call credential segmentation is looking at how you authenticate users to different systems. A lot of people will deploy IoT devices and say, well, it's cloud centralized. All the data is going to the cloud, so it's secure by default. Not the case. We know that, right? Look into what that security matrix looks like for you in your shared responsibility model, because centralized data could also mean you have now created a new single point of failure. And that's really what we need to avoid deploying any type of IoT or IIoT deployment that we think builds efficacy or solves a business case problem or really catapults us into some type of analytics that we didn't have in the past from a user perspective, not a security perspective. That still means you could have created a new single point of failure from a security perspective, and you have to evaluate that. Again, even if it's only read-only, you have to understand what the implications are of that access and where you put those networks and how you segment that across the board.
Right. So I think you highlighted two of the ones that I think are absolutely critical, and that's the attack surface. Minimize your attack surface in the space, and you call it credentialing. And I think it's role-based access. So if there's not a need to know, a need to access that information, you need to be truncating that access to that arena. I do think there's a space that sometimes we forget about, and everyone tries to solve all the problems when they may not have the capabilities within their own ecosystem, their own infrastructure. How difficult is it to balance the threats to assets and systems versus threats from specific threat actors, their capabilities, and TTPs? So there's one thing to be saying that you're going to defend against the high school hacker or someone that's trying to do something to make money. Very difficult when you talk about fear, uncertainty, and doubt. If you're painting the advanced persistent threat, there's very little likelihood any of the small and medium-sized businesses have any capabilities to defend against a nation-state actor. So how do we better foster that relationship from the private sector back to the public sector and vice versa on information sharing, so that you can start to address the APT world and nation state without just throwing that out there every time and painting it as you can't win in this world? Joyce.
Well, first, I think you have to conduct a really thorough risk assessment across your different cyber physical domains to identify all of those vulnerabilities and all of those potential threats and all of their potential impact. One of the things that we do on a regular basis is to develop a systems map or systems thinking on mapping out all of those areas so that mitigation strategies that address the specific challenges and characteristics of each domain. Defense in depth strategy, implement a defense in depth strategy that involves multiple layers of security controls. And I think that's what Jose was saying a little bit earlier. This approach ensures that even if one layer is compromised, other layers can still provide protection. Implement measures such as firewalls, intrusion detection, prevention systems, access control encryption, and strong authentication mechanisms. That's not saying that, there's a silver bullet and you're going to, close every single door, because they're moving just as fast as we hopefully are. So just making sure that some of those back doors and trap doors and holes in the wall are adequately mitigated so that you don't have any surprises. What the SEC is doing, I think, is going to really kind of put the spotlight on boards of directors who are going to be responsible and held accountable for those things that are happening farther down the line. So I think there's going to be greater scrutiny from the board level on what the folks down at the IT level are doing.
Jose, Danielle, anything to add?
This is actually my specialty area, so I don't want to go too in depth, but this is what my research focuses on at the Atlantic Council, and it's the assets versus functions debate typically. And I'll bring it back to a term I already kind of harped on before, which is context. You have to understand the context of your operations to do risk management, period. You know that. But then I also mentioned approaching security with an effects-based mindset. The two most important priorities for context are A, location, and B, existing mitigations. So when you do vulnerability analysis, when you do risk analysis, you have to know what your location impacts are. If you're in a city, or if you're in a rural area, if you're a bulk electric system, if you're a rural substation, if you have backup plans, that's part of your mitigation. If you have existing security controls, if you have existing gaps for visibility, you have networks that you don't maintain or have any redundancy for, right? So those two things are the most important components of this when you're looking at threats to versus threats from. Here are the two issues. When you look at threats to systems, you're going to spend all of your time and resources understanding and analyzing known CVEs to particular vendor products, which may not reduce your overall risk by any statistically significant measure. At the same time, there actually are particular steps in terms of updates or low-hanging fruit, again, the less sexy, not FUD-related best practices that could statistically reduce your risk depending on the context, right? However, at the same time, you could spend all of your efforts and all of your money on bringing in a third party to do a tabletop exercise that just focuses on a particular threat actor capability that might not be the most likely impact to your actual crown jewels. And you could do the same thing for having kind of very little awareness. You would bring in a third party and they would just maybe say, let's exercise ransomware. And if you read the news, ransomware is important. So you say yes. And so you build your program around defending against ransomware, where at the same time you have no credential access authentication to your ICS from a remote substation. So you really have to build that context. And that starts with culture. It starts with having your leadership be honest and open with you about what your resources look like. And again, we have no man-to-man security. So if at any point you are stuck looking at the CVE database and trying to manually go back and map the vendor systems that you own and operate to the available CVEs out there, you are already digging yourself into a hole that you're not going to be able to get out of from a risk management perspective. You really do have to go back to what is my context? What are my crown jewels? What is the worst effects-based scenario that could happen with cyber, period, not just with the capabilities of a known threat actor? What is my location and what are my existing mitigations, right? So that's kind of the impact or flow chart decision tree that I would put out there for folks.
Yeah, I think they'd ask us to save 10 to 15 minutes for audience questions, but I actually don't see any audience questions. So am I missing something? Maybe they're just anxious to get out for the day.
I see two in the chat.
Okay, in the chat. So
they're in the Q&A.
I'm not looking at.
Yeah,
sure.
no, it's in the Q&A.
Yeah,
for Microsoft, is Defender for OT based on the CyberX acquisition? If not, what happened to CyberX? That's a fun question.
Oh, that's a good question, Jose. Go ahead.
That's a great question. I think I've answered this probably at least 1,000 times. So yes, the CyberX platform is what became Defender for IoT for us. That team just migrated into our ecosystem over the last 12 months. It's gotten facelift. It's been kind of tailored more into the, to have the Microsoft look and feel to it. So yes, the team's still there. We still have the team based out of Israel. And so they haven't gone anywhere, and they're safe in case you were looking for them. Feel free to ping me if you're still looking for them. I can help out.
And then the next question was, is anomaly detection outdated? Also, what is a follow-up to anomaly detection? So anomaly detection, like I said, based on pattern recognition, is kind of the very base of anomaly detection. Once you look at more sophisticated applications of anomaly detection, you start to see behavioral baselines. So that's what Nozomi Networks does for our anomaly detection. There are similar tools out there. That behavior takes your context into account. So it doesn't just do pattern recognition for known exploits. It looks at behaviors within your environment that start to become out of norm or slip out of scope and detect on that as well. And then the future of anomaly detection is actually looking towards marrying physical variables with data and communications variables so that you can actually have a detection for something in your communications traffic, but you can also build a simultaneous detection for when your physical process slips out of scope. So maybe the variables for your flow parameters are between X and Y, and that slips out of scope. Your anomaly detection tool can actually alert on both. So not just, hey, this vendor system got a function code that the system knows it shouldn't receive based on the OEM configuration, but also, the scope of your process has slipped out of what you told us was the norm. Go investigate that and try to do some proactive security awareness around that. So those are kind of the layers of basic anomaly detection that's pattern recognition, all the way up to marrying the security and the physical notifications of baseline behavior and norms.
So I think that someone, at least, well, I see one in chat now, not in the Q&A, said, I'd like to know how cloud computing can help in the energy and power generation industry. And this person's looking for research or for a topic for his master's. So anyone want to bounce in on the cloud environment, how it might help or hurt?
Well, I'll start with the biggest risk, and then I kind of, don't want to spend the rest of the 9 minutes here being the only person talking. But the biggest concern from a security perspective that I've seen utilities have on cloud is not owning the infrastructure that they have to quote unquote secure. So the number one thing, I did a talk on this last year at the SCADA Tech Summit here in Dallas, where I live. And I mentioned it a little bit earlier. There's a shared responsibility model for cloud. And I think we're starting to get over that hump with NERC SIP and others looking at, who owns what and what rails you're riding in terms of infrastructure you own and infrastructure you, for lack of a better word, kind of rent or sit on top of. And so that's really the most important dichotomy to understand when you go to actually verify security controls on something you may not wholesale own and operate under your organization. I think it'd be a really interesting research project for the big three cloud prospects out there, which Jose knows a lot about one of them, I'm sure.
So I think so. I think that in my space, so working the cyber supply chain risk management, I often talk about hardware assurance, software assurance, and assured services. Assured services is a classic example where you've outsourced a capability and you're now having to rely on security from an outsourced capability, a third party. Cloud is one representative example of that. Jose, do you have something to add in that arena?
Sure. I guess just to his point is, how does the cloud help the energy industry? For the hopefully it is for your masters. If it is, I think cloud computing it's not just the utility space. I think it helps across the board. Being able to leverage the expansion and being able to kind of roll out assets much quicker. And being able to the kind of I'll tell you some of the stuff I wrote during my degree program was understand with the cloud, it's one of those things where you get to build out an infrastructure at a much more efficient cost rate, just because everybody would love to own their own cloud and be able to own it and manage it and it be more secure because you have it there, you're kind of full control of it. But it's not realistic to say we have the resources. Every company or utility company has the resources to actually to do this. So if you have to take in consideration the cloud is being used, and this is any cloud, and not specifically Microsoft, any cloud system, they all have the level of security that the CIA, DoD use. So if their information which is I consider some of the highest level of security needed, if they have their own clouds that they use through the vendors, not anyone specific. And so if we're able to secure that type of data in the cloud, utility companies and any other vertical should be, a little more confident to say that, some of this can actually be secured and locked down properly. And then the benefits from that is that you can leverage we've been beating it down with the layers of defense there, but the cloud gives you the ability to add, the machine learning, the understanding your data flow. You take the data, roll it into a SIM, a SOAR. You can apply the AI stuff. You can add new things to it and really look at the data, not just from one source, but from multiple sources. So take all your logs, take all your multiple security tools, regardless of what they are, and be able to correlate the data from the beginning to the end. So if you do get attacked, you see it coming hopefully from a mile away, and then you can mitigate that quicker. You always hear the saying, don't try to prevent not being attacked, is to be ready when you are attacked. Because as much as we want to believe we will never succumb to an attack. What's that?
I said you got to do both. You want to prevent where you can prevent, but you have to be ready because you're going to be attacked.
You got to be ready. So the emphasis is never on the recovery plan. Your recovery plan needs to be as strong as your preventative plan there.
It's not a matter. It's not a matter of
if, it's when.
If it's a matter of when.
Exactly.
You're going to be attacked. It's a matter of how you react to it.
Sure.
So I think we're down to the last few minutes of the panel. I'd like to thank you guys for joining us, panel members especially. Great insights. I'm going to give you one last question and let you give a parting, to the group, 1 minute or so answer. So, not limiting yourself, but how does the energy and utility sector address the unique challenges of securing a diverse range of devices and endpoints in IIoT ecosystem? So you can do this from a macro perspective of just generic IT/OT, or drill all the way down to the specific energy details, Danielle, which you're really good at in that space. So I kind of like it. So Joyce, can I go for you first?
I suppose maybe robust, a couple of things. The robust device management, implement a centralized device management system. A lot of people do not have an asset management tool. They do it off the back of a napkin. And that way they have control over they try to have control.
So I would add, so when you say asset management, the first one's just visibility. What assets do you have?
Absolutely. I mean, there's so many cases, particularly in Don, this in the federal government, and that's shadow IT. It includes maintaining an inventory of all devices, monitoring their status, ensuring timely software updates, and patch management. I mean, I think that is absolutely key. You got to have that. And of course, access control and authentication. I think that's the whole purpose behind Zero Trust. So you got to have that strong access control to ensure that only authorized devices and users can access the IIoT ecosystem.
How about you, Danielle? How about your shot at that one?
Yeah, so I would say my favorite approach that I've ever seen is, to be completely honest with you, I would never discount threat actors and nation state level sophisticated adversaries in the world. However, I've seen a lot of energy environments, and there are misconfiguration, human errors, accidents, tripwires that you may not know exist. And I think that it is well within the resource capacity of every single energy company in the world to change the way that they do red teaming, to not look at the organization as what can I defend against and what can an adversary do from the outside, but to start to begin to understand single points of failure within my organization, places where I can change an IP address and have a cascading failure across a control network that I might not have knew. You don't need a pen tester to do those sorts of conversations. It lives in a couple of best practice documents, but the IT/OT conversation, you'll never hear me use the word convergence unless I'm repeating somebody else's words. It's interoperability. So how do you have focus groups where you continue to push interoperability while maintaining that, flipping the script on your red team and understanding single points of failure, interdependence, complex interdependence, right, across the organization and not just two teams, because it could be billing systems, it could be not having the redundancy to rip and replace things where you can't patch systems. And again, you don't need external experts to tell you how to do these things.
So Jose, I lost your video. Are you still there?
Technology is wonderful when it works.
Would love to thank Jose and Microsoft for hosting the panel and closing out the IIoT event for the day. I think that wraps us up and gets you out with 1 minute to spare. Thank you guys so much. Great participation. Hate that we lost Jose for his closing comments.
Yeah. Thanks, Don, for your leadership on the panel
guys.
today. Thank you. Thanks, Joyce.
Live long and prosper.
Oh, Jose, wait. He's coming back in.
Oh,
Jose, we lost you. I offered you a 1 minute parting comment from our Microsoft sponsor, Jose. Close us out.
Problem. I apologize. I don't know. It just froze up on me. I could see and hear you guys, and I could see myself, but I guess you guys can hear me. I think the ladies did a great job of summing up the questions, so I'll just kind of summarize what they said. Use that layered approach. Make sure you have security tools and implement plans that are specific for what you're doing and what's best for your environment. Invest in training and awareness. Make sure everyone understands, what's going on and understands that threat landscape. Security controls at the device, network, and application layer, and then also work with the vendors. The vendors are going to be your source there. Work with them. Ensure that they're on the same page. Let them know what you're looking for. Don't just let them tell you what you need. You need to tell them what you need.
Great. Thank you guys so much.